Nigel's guest here on the Sans Showbiz podcast is Dave Phillips, who has been broadcasting on the wireless for over 50 years.
It's Dave Phillips. Hello, Dave.
Hello. Good to talk to you after almost 25 years.
And it's incredible. 25 years. Where's that gone? We used to work together at the Bay, didn't we?
We did indeed. Yes. And you were relatively local to that area in Lancaster, I think, weren't you at that time?
Yeah, I still am. I'm still at Lytham St. Anne's, just down the road. It was like a 45-minute journey. It was quicker to get there than it was to get to Fleetwood.
How bizarre is that? Whereas I live on the Wirral, and it used to take me almost 2 hours sometimes.
Never.
And I always dreaded that journey on the M6 because there was always that worry that there was going to be some sort of hold up or crash and I wouldn't make it in time.
Did that ever actually happen where you didn't make it?
It didn't, but what did happen on the way back, because if you remember, I was doing overnight shows, weekend overnights, because I was teaching full time.
Yeah.
And at one time I did the Sunday to Monday overnight, 12 midnight to 6 in the morning. And I would drive home, have a shower, get changed and go and teach all day. On one occasion when I was driving back from Lancaster, I did momentarily fall asleep while I was driving on the M6.
Oh my.
Hit the rumble strip and thought, radio's wonderful, but I don't want to die doing it.
I had an overnight shift as well on a Sunday night, I think I used to do.
Right.
I used to do the Sunday afternoon show 2 till 6. I used to get some tea, try and get a little kip, and then was back on at 12. It's crackers, isn't it?
I mean, I had an even more bizarre situation where I was doing breakfast on March of Gold in Wrexham, Saturday and Sunday, 6 till 10. And then I was given a Saturday afternoon show on Radio City in Liverpool. And bearing in mind, this is the weekend where I'm supposed to be relaxing from, a full week's teaching. But I was a lot younger then, as we both were.
Yeah. So how did it all start then, Dave, in the first place? When did it start for you? What made you want to be on the radio? Well, I suppose
what it was, I did well at school at the end of what they would call year 9 now. I think I came top of the class, and my dad said, "What would you like as a present for coming top?" And I said, "I'd love a transistor radio." And bearing in mind, we're talking mid-60s here. Transistor radios were state-of-the-art technology then. So he bought me one for the princely sum of 13 guineas, which again was a lot of money. I think he bought it on HP. And that's when I was suddenly discovering the world of radio. And this is pirate radio time, Radio Caroline North off the coast of the Isle of Man. And listening to that and the wonderful 60s music, I thought, this is what I want to do. I would love to be on the radio.
Yeah.
So I also had one of these Philips 4-track tape recorders. So I recorded a demo. And I sent it to Radio Merseyside, who were one of the few local stations in existence then. And they duly received it and said, "Thank you for your tape, but you've recorded it at 3 3/4. I'm afraid we can't listen to it. Can you redo it at 7 1/2?" Which I did.
Yeah.
And then they listened to it and they wrote back to me, which again is unusual because, as you know, most radio stations receive demos and either put them in the bin or record over them. But anyway, they sent a letter back to me and it said, "Thank you for your demo, which we just listened to. We can tell that you've been very enthusiastic about it, but your voice isn't suited to radio because it tends to be dull and flat in places."
Never.
Now, you can imagine, as a teenager, I was devastated. This is what I want to do.
Yeah.
So anyway, I pursued the career in teaching, which I also loved, did 40 years as a maths teacher, and it was brilliant. But I started in hospital radio in the early 70s. Yeah. And that was the start for me, really.
What do you actually teach at school? What were you teaching?
I taught maths. I taught secondary school maths. I spent most of my career in an all-girls comprehensive school in Wallasey, which is where I was born. And I absolutely loved it because I have a passion for maths. And because I wasn't brilliant at it at school, I think I was able to teach it well because I'd struggled myself at times. And so I always taught it idiot's guide, I suppose. Whereas some of my colleagues who came in with PhDs and that, they found it difficult to get back to the level that, the girls were at. Yeah. So a very satisfying career. And when I finished, I worked out I must have taught 6,200 girls over the course of 40 years. And it's nice to think in old age, I would have had an influence on some of them. Not all. Some would have said, well, he was an idiot, couldn't stand him. But there were a lot that did. And I like to think that, they came in at 11. Most girls particularly had already been turned off maths from primary school. So they came in with long faces. I hate this subject. I'm rubbish at it. And I like to think by the time they left at the end of the sixth form, they actually had a passion for it.
So did the two cross over then, the radio presenting with the teaching?
They did indeed, yes, because obviously end of term discos, that was always my forte, whenever we did that, just with a couple of sort of bog standard record decks and a PA microphone. But I loved it. I loved doing that, yeah. And towards the end of my career, I moved, the school I was in had a very own radio station. So I was involved in that for a short time as well.
I remember always doing the prefect school disco. I used to get that gig because I was a prefect.
Yes.
I thought, well, Nigel will do it, I made a bit of a mistake once, Dave. I played Ivor Biggin.
Yes, remember that. Yeah.
The kids were asking for it, and I didn't really think it through properly.
No,
and the teachers were there, and I played that, and I never did another gig there.
Yes,
but there you go.
I'm more comfortable being on the radio in a room on my own. I never really took to discos, which is why I never did them outside of the school. I love just being in the intimacy, if you like, of radio.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, but I did go out as a professional doing the clubs for a couple of years. I did that. I had my own little agency. So I got used to performing, I think, there with big crowds, ready for when we went on the outside broadcast. And then I thought, I quite enjoyed that, to be honest. I think it was a bit more of a challenge. But I'm like you, it's nice and comfy in a studio, isn't it, sometimes?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
What's your favourite playout system, Dave, for all those years?
Well, I've used quite a few over the years. At Radio City back in the 90s, which is where I started my professional career, Dallas had just come in, but it was only to play the ads. We were still playing everything else off CD, and in the Gold Studio, we had something like 900 carts, where a lot of the songs were on those. So you play the CDs, you play the carts, but when you came to an ad break, you click on the mouse and play them that way. So at the time, that was fine. And then when I moved to March of Gold in Wrexham, they didn't have a play-out system originally. Theirs was all, well, they actually had a turntable in the studio in those days, an EMT turntable, but they had CD players. And we used to have, I think, 10 cart machines in the studio because a lot of the programs were split with Coast FM in Colwyn Bay. Yeah. So when you went to an ad break, you'd hit a button and, separate carts would play for the whole of the ad break. But of course, being carts, they sometimes jammed. And so you'd have to take the cart out and think, right, we're 20 seconds short now on goal. What? Oh, hang on. There's an ad for 20 seconds, which wouldn't have been paid for. Stick that in and so on.
And because you're a maths teacher, I mean, obviously that would be easy to you.
That's right. As was back timing. I know a lot of presenters in the days before computers find it an absolute nightmare back timing to the news, but that was never an issue for me, of course.
Yeah, I was all right with the back timing. Maths was probably my strongest subject, and English is definitely not. I was really poor at English. And maybe that's one reason I liked, going on the radio, because I thought I'm pretty rubbish at actually speaking English. And then, sometimes when, I don't know whether you've actually done this, when you've read a news bulletin out, and when sometimes they used to just bung the script in 2 minutes before you're actually going to leave it.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
And I used to think, oh, blimey, I'm not sure about that word there.
Yes.
And I used to just sort of like fluff over it pretty quickly. So you could hardly tell if I was pronouncing it right or not.
Well, if you think that's bad, I spent a good 7 or 8 years of my career working at March of Gold in Wrexham, and of course, loads of Welsh place names. I'm not from that area, so it's took me a long time to sort of get my head round Gwersylt and places like that. Mold, Ruthin was another one. I used to have to write them down phonetically. And of course, as you know, you've only got to get one of them wrong, and the listeners are, call yourself a local presenter.
That's it.
Why can't you pronounce these words correctly? So that was a baptism of fire for me. But to answer your original question, they brought in Genesis, which again at the time was state of the art, and I enjoyed that. But then when I moved to present station, Chester's D Radio, they from the start had used RCS Master Control, which is a brilliant system. and that's now been superseded by Zeta. And if you're working at home, Zeta to go. And I have to say, that's got to be the best system I've ever used. And it's becoming the industry standard as well, I think.
Right. I've not used those two, actually. I've only used Play Out One and also Myriad. They were just very similar, them two, really, to be honest with you. They work basically the same.
I remember I did actually use Myriad briefly. I worked for a station called KCR, Knowsley Community Radio in Prescot, and I think they use that system as well.
Yeah.
The one I've not used, and the one that everybody said was a nightmare, it was Encodad. It had a very short life, and thankfully I never had to use that. Yeah.
I remember learning on the job, as it were, for the Playout system when we got Myriad. And I think it was about 2002. They had it installed at the Bay, and they said, "Oh, get on with that." The guys hardly showed you. Oh, just press the green button.
No,
press
that's
the
right.
go button, and that'll find the next. See you now. Bye-bye. Get on with the drive show. See how you can. Right. Oh, I've never had so many bad heads as that week. It was me and Tony Cookson, and we got our heads around it. And everybody else was totally lost, I think. When some people aren't interested in even trying to think about sorting it out, they just want to go and present. But
that's right. Yeah.
Very worrying when you're not in control. You're not concentrating on your show. You're concentrating on working all the technical bit of it.
That's right. And that reminds me of another story where when I joined Chester's D Radio, a very experienced presenter who'd worked at Radio City, sadly no longer with us, called Paul Leckie. He was given some shifts over Christmas and New Year. And of course, the first one, Saturday morning, breakfast, nobody else in the building. Never used RCS master control. And of course, it crashed as these systems do. Yeah. And of course, it was an absolute nightmare. It was a car crash for him through no fault of his because he was an experienced presenter. There was a backup CD and he ended up playing the same track about 10 times. And sadly, he was never asked to come back again.
That's bad, isn't it?
It is bad because, as I say, he was a very talented presenter, but he was, as you say, thrown in at the deep end and no support at that time.
Yeah, what's the biggest star you've interviewed on the radio then, Dave?
Oh, now there's a difficult question. I'm trying to think of somebody recently. OMD, yes, Andy McCluskey. Now that was an interesting one actually because I was told I had to record this interview for Love 80s, which we can talk about later, which is another station I run. Yeah, and they said it would be great to have an interview with Andy McCluskey of OMD because they've just brought a new album out. But you'll have to do it via Zoom. So I duly went to the studio in Chester, called him up on Zoom, and it turned out he lived in and was talking from a village called Frankby, which is literally 5 minutes from where I live in Greasby. So as we both said, I could have gone round to his house and recorded it live. But he was absolutely brilliant because he'd lived and he still lives on the Wirral. He went to Caldy Grammar School where my grandchildren go. So we had a lot in common. But an interesting story he told me was when he was at primary school in Mells. Now there's another interesting place name, Meols. Meols is how people will often present, but it's Mells anyway. He said when he was 8, he joined the school recorder group with another friend who's now in OMD. And they were chucked out of the recorder group after a few weeks because they refused to learn to read music, which is ironic when you think the sort of mega career they've had.
Yeah, crazy. Have you had anything really funny happen to you on air?
Oh, now there's an interesting question. Well, I suppose one of the most memorable moments for me was a few years ago when at D we were promoting 10 of Us, which is a cancer charity. And as part of their fundraising, the idea came up for me to be arrested on air and put in prison. So I was doing the Saturday sports show, and towards the end of the show, and this was all videoed, of course, a policeman from North Wales Police came in and arrested me live on air, put the handcuffs on, and then escorted me to the van outside, and I was driven to Mole Police Station where I was put in a cell. And the idea was that listeners who were obviously told about this throughout the day were going to send money to have me released from jail so that I would be back at D in time for my show on the Sunday. It had a massive reaction on Facebook and YouTube, but more importantly, it raised lots of money for a very worthwhile charity. So it was a very memorable night for me. and produce some good radio as well.
So, have you had any landmark shows? When I say this, I mean something like historicals happened. I've had quite a few of those happen to me when I'm actually on the air.
Yes, yeah. And again, it was the early days of Radio City. I'd only been there about 6 months, so I was still a new presenter, having done hospital radio for years, but that was my first professional gig. And I was driving in to do the overnight, Saturday into Sunday, and the news, IRN news came on at 1:00, and they said, we're just getting reports of a car crash in Paris involving the Princess of Wales. So I immediately flicked to Radio 4, which I wouldn't normally listen to, and they had a bit more information. So I thought this could be a serious story here. Yeah. So I go into the studio, and we have a television monitor like they had at the Bay. And at that time, BBC TV used to close down at about midnight, but this particular night they carried on. And we had that memorable moment, that the system with IRN was, if there's a death in the royal family, a blue light flashes in the studio. Yeah. And of course, around about 5:00 in the morning, it did. And it said, we're going to do a clock start at 5:30. So opt into that, please. And the routine, thankfully, I'd been told about the routine, was if there's a death in the royal family, you must play the obituary tape, which was a huge reel of tape, which was in the studio, labeled, but it had one of those, are they called NAB centers? The bit that goes in the middle of the reel. Yeah. And of course, could we find one of these centers to put in? So we were rushing all over the building looking for that. Eventually we found it, and we started playing classical music. And that was a difficult gig because obviously it was a very serious moment. Yeah. But, people waking up on the Friday or Saturday morning, whenever it was, they weren't expecting to hear Handel's water music on, Magic 1548. And so that was challenging. I was on air for the funeral, which was the week afterwards. Yeah. And I think I was also on air at Marcher when Princess Margaret died. So certainly those are the outstanding moments for me, the ones that were really challenging. Yeah. But the nice thing about that is after it was all over at Radio City, I actually had a letter from Dave Shearer, who was the program controller at that time, saying, thank you for all that you've done. We really appreciate it. It was obviously a very difficult time for you.
Yeah, it was a difficult time, that. And I always remember I was actually on that day, like yourself. And I remember you have to do a completely different style, obviously.
Oh, yes.
Radio presenting. It's very simplistic, actually, what we were doing. There was no adverts, and you just had to do quite generic links, to be honest with you. And the hard part was getting from that sort of radio output to normal radio output.
Yes, yeah.
Well, nearly normal. And I was put on a shift, I think it was a couple of days later, when they said, well, we're going to have to start to return to sort of some sort of normality this week.
Exactly.
So
yes.
Your job on these 4 hours is to go from that type of radio to nearly normal. And I found that quite challenging, but it was quite interesting to do, actually. And I must admit, after those experiences, you feel a little bit more an in-depth presenter, don't you, after handling those sort of circumstances?
Yeah. Again, being thrown in the deep end, but it's great experience. But I know exactly what you're saying about the transition, because between the death of the Princess of Wales till the following Saturday, I think it was when the funeral was, we went back to semi-normal programs. We dropped all the ads. Yeah. Obviously, we couldn't really be as light-hearted as we would normally be. So it was just a case of this is, which is not the sort of radio I like to do. But there's one even worse difficult situation I was in when Radio City 1548 AM, as it was called, changed to Magic 1548. Yeah. And they said, there's going to be a transition. We're going to have a weekend where we only play songs with magic mentioned in it. So there's only a limited number of songs that have magic in it. So we spent the whole of the 4-hour show just playing these same songs over and over again. Yeah. I don't know whose idea that was, but it wasn't a good one, I have to say.
Who's been your favorite radio presenter then over the years? Is there a radio presenter that you admire?
Yeah, I suppose the one that would be number one for me would be the late Steve Wright. I think he was absolutely wonderful. He stood the test of time. He was there on Radio Luxembourg originally, Radio 1, and then he moved to Radio 2. And I think had he not died, I think the BBC would have brought him back to what they're talking about, a sort of Radio 2 Plus that will play older music.
Yeah.
I know he had a conversation with Paul Gambaccini just a few days before he died, and he said, have you heard anything yet about Radio 2 Plus? Which they hadn't at that stage.
Yeah.
But I think he lived for radio, didn't he? And that was his whole life. He got into the studio, into the building at 9 o'clock in the morning, didn't leave till 5. And I believe when he went on holiday, he used to go to the States frequently. I think one of his children lived over there. Yeah. And he would spend most of the time, not sightseeing as you or I might do, but actually in a hotel room with a radio, just listening to all the different radios. I think I'm an anorak, but that's in a different league altogether.
I tell you what, I do like about Steve Wright, and I think that's what I'll miss. And I always liked the way he did all the production. I'm a bit of a production nut, really, and I love doing all that. And I think about when I used to listen to his shows, what he was putting it all together. No wonder it took a lot of time to put together, which people don't appreciate, do they, behind the scenes? It takes a lot of time to put it all together, and I think he's probably one of the best people I've ever known for doing all that work. And
indeed,
doing it himself.
Because what you weren't aware of was that he would do a lot of it live, but he would go to pre-rec interviews and so on, and you would have no idea. They were so smooth, wasn't it? You wouldn't know whether it was live or whatever. Yeah. Although I do remember one memorable occasion, because he had his fascinating facts, didn't he?
He did.
I heard the same fascinating facts twice in the same show. Now, he didn't refer to it, but I can imagine he would have been furious about that because he was a perfectionist in that way. And I'm a bit the same myself. I'm a bit OCD. Yeah. I like to back time. I like everything to be perfect. And sometimes it isn't, because that's life, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm a bit like that myself. How's your family cope with all this radio? I mean, I'm thinking back to my experiences, and are you allowed to talk about the radio when you get home?
Oh, well, whether I'm allowed to or not, I do. And my wife, bless her, she is absolutely wonderful, but she's got no interest in radio. And I can see her eyes glazing over when I talk about transmitter sites I've been looking at. And this is what so-and-so did today. You wouldn't believe this. At the moment, I've just come to the end of 8 days of radio, but non-stop. And I've worked out I've done 57 hours on the radio in 8 days. Yeah. But thankfully, she's away in Chicago at the moment visiting her son, which is good, because had she been here, she would have been going absolutely mad. We're supposed to be retired and you're on the radio all the time.
Yeah. So what's the future then, Dave, for radio in the UK, do you think?
Well, I think it's obviously the big groups are dominating now, aren't they? Bauer and Global. And we're not going to change that. In fact, the two might even merge one day. And so I think we've got to recognize that the heritage stations like Radio City don't exist anymore and never will do. But what I find interesting is the growth of small scale DAB radio and community radio. Yeah. Because I think they're fulfilling an important job. And I know at D, it's something we are very supportive of. We own one of the multiplexes and actually allow other stations to broadcast on it, which is great for the listener. But for people like you and I who want to actually get paid to do radio, there are fewer and fewer opportunities to do that. And I don't think that that's going to change.
Yeah, I think that impacts on the quality then, to be honest with you.
Undoubtedly. Yeah.
It's not as good because you need professional people. Or most, like you said, Dave, most of the people that we know are no longer actually in radio, are they? The real top guys. They're not.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a shame.
And that's why I have to pinch myself all the time, because compared to those top guys you're talking about, I was a fairly bog standard presenter. I know I'm competent. I know I'm reliable, but I'm never going to set the world on fire. Nobody's going to invite me to do a, all singing, all dancing breakfast show. And so to be in the position I am at my age, still getting paid to do a lot of radio, when, as you say, all these big names are no longer doing it, it's a very privileged position. Yeah. As I often say, many men of my age have a hobby like golf, which costs you money. I've got a hobby that pays money, not a fortune, but it's great to get paid for what you've always wanted to do.
Yeah, you've still got the voice, Dave. Your voice hasn't changed actually since those 25 years when we worked together. It's still the same, which is remarkable, isn't it? Really?
It is. I've had to work at that because I'm very conscious of the fact that as men get older, their voice does change. And the examples I would quote there are people like David Jacobs and Brian Matthew, stellar presenters in the 60s and 70s, still wanted to do it when they got old. But towards the end, Brian Matthew on Sounds of the 60s, and David Jacobs' Sunday night show, you could hear you were listening to very old men. And I think if I reached that stage, I would bow out gracefully because I think you've got to sound right. But there is an exception to that, and that's Desmond Carrington. I don't know whether you remember him as a presenter.
Yeah.
He was with Radio 2 towards the end. He'd been an actor in the 60s, and he had his own studio in Perth in Scotland where he lived, and his partner was his producer. And even I think he died at 92, 93, he sounded just the same. Yeah. And I thought, if I can be like that, I'll carry on. But if I can't, I'll give in gracefully.
Well, you're all right at the moment, I can assure you.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Right, we're running out of time.
Right,
you could talk for maybe 3 or 4 hours. Actually, on radio,
I could, and bore everybody that's not into radio, because we've not even touched upon Love 80s, which is the other pet project of mine. Which is
we'll do that another time. You're quite welcome to come back on another podcast another time, and we'll do that.
That would be nice. That would be nice.
There's lots to chat about, and it's always great to listen to. We usually finish off with 3 questions here on the San Showbiz podcast. So are you up for that? They're not difficult.
Yep. No, I'll try. Yeah.
Go on. The first question is, who's been your biggest artist or band that you loved as a kid?
That is very easy to answer because it had to be the Beatles. Growing up in the Liverpool area in the 60s, it was all going on around me. We had members of the Foremost who lived down the road from me, and the Undertakers and so on. But because I was only a teenager, I wasn't old enough to go to the Cavern and actually see the Beatles. But they would be the biggest influence on my life. I've got every one of their albums on CD and on vinyl. That's how sad I am.
Excellent. It's not sad. I can remember my mum and dad having every album and everything. I can remember the record labels. They were always black, weren't they?
They were indeed. First song, the first 7-inch single I ever bought was the Beatles, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, which is still one of their best, I think.
Classic. Right, we'll continue. That's question 1. Question number 2, what's your favourite car you've had or would like?
That's difficult. I've never been into sort of particularly fast cars, but back in probably the 90s, I had a 2.6 litre Vauxhall Amiga. And that was an amazing car. At the time, the Prime Minister had one of those, chauffeur driven, of course. Yeah. And I'm ashamed to admit it now, but there were times when I did exceed the speed limit on that because it was such a powerful car that, you didn't know how fast you were going. But it cost a fortune. You'd fill up for £90, a huge tank then, and you do about 250 miles. And my wife said to me, absolutely. Yeah, whereas now I drive, which is probably technically the best car I've ever owned, and that's a Toyota Corolla Sport. The technology in that with Apple CarPlay and all that stuff is brilliant.
Cheryl Baker was on with me a couple of weeks ago, and she said that's her favourite car.
Right. So reliable. They do everything you want them to do without any difficulty. So,
excellent.
That would... I've no desire to change that, but as my wife frequently says, you always say that, and then after 3 years you get bored and you want a new car. So she's probably right about that too, as wives tend to be about
they're always right. Yes, they're always right, definitely. Question number 3 then. What's your favourite go-to snack? If you're doing a radio show and you're feeling a little bit peckish, what would you always have in your bag as a little snack just to keep you going?
No, I tend not to eat. I tend to drink either water or hot water and lemon because it's good for the throat, isn't it? Yeah. At one time, I used to take Yorkie bars with me. That was my go-to. And I think when I was at the Bay, I used to have an energy drink as well, but I wouldn't do that now. And again, on the Bay, I remember about 3:00 in the morning going into the kitchen and having Frosties as my snack in the middle of the night. Yeah.
I used to have those energy drinks, and I used to find that they Well, it got me zapped up a little bit. And if you had 2 or 3, whoa, you were way over the top, weren't you?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Crazy stuff. Okay, that's the 3 questions. Everybody answers those questions. We've had some really interesting answers as well.
I can imagine.
It's been great having you on the show. What we will do, though, you mentioned the 80s and that special show and everything. We'll come back with that on another podcast in the future, if that's all right with you.
That would be good, because that, again, is the future of radio, because as well as being broadcast on DAB in the Northwest, it's internet, and the audience there is just massive.
Yeah. Before you go, though, what's the best way people can actually listen to you on air? And maybe find out a little bit more about you as well. Are you on the social medias and everything?
I am. Yes. Dave Phillips on Facebook. Yeah. I'm on LinkedIn as well. My regular Sunday show on D and Silk, which is from Macclesfield, and D from Chester, is from 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. So they can hear me on that. And if you want to listen to me on Love 80s, I'm literally on 24 hours a day on that. I pop up. I do a TV trivia, I do a pop quiz, I do a film trivia, I do music news. So I'm there all the time, night and day. Love 80s Liverpool, Love 80s Manchester, which are also available anywhere on the smart speaker, of course.
Anyway, it's been great having you on the show. I love it. And it's great listening to your voice again, Dave.
Thank you. And it's really good to catch up with you after all this time.
Yeah, well, we'll keep in touch anyway. And we'll get you on that next podcast soon so everybody can listen about it. Because I'm right into the 80s. I mean, that is my era, really. I love the 80s. There's so much music from the 80s.
Yeah. So I'd love your feedback on that, if you sort of give it a listen sometimes and tell me what you think about it. It's not a live radio station. We don't have any live presenters. Yeah. But I think, it's very entertaining because of the music, not because of me necessarily.
Okay, Dave Phillips, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll catch you soon. Okay, take care. Don't do too much on the radio, though, yeah?
I'll try not to, but it's very difficult at the moment, I have to admit. Thanks, Nigel. Really good to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
If you loved what you heard, make sure to hit subscribe on this podcast channel to never miss an episode. Stay connected and become part of the Sands Showbiz family by following us on our social media platforms. Your ticket to the heart of showbiz awaits every Monday. See you next time.